vindoje kluno we kai konyeton. Alors ma vle jakpata menu rengle tondoje mito na gbele. Alors mlo renja mononjo emre chewe si yokpo busi nu esena nyeme kanai adikwa do wenu we nchokoto kanche ayi no lesa no wenye kano bodo cheke mbodagbeche na fonte gbebu na ledo cheke boketole na fonte gbebu kano mo cheke ah ino na to chesi welo.
Hello and welcome to episode 41 of Afrikanists Assemble. It seems that for the documentation and description of anything, humans need categories. And for those working with languages, the categories have long been parts of speech. Since we're all about looking at the world through African languages, this is the question we asked our contributors this month. In what ways do you think African languages challenge the linguistic categories of parts of speech, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, etc., that have long been dominant in language research and teaching? Take a listen to their thoughts on the matter.
In spite of the many differences between languages of the world, there are still some universal language properties that different languages of the world share in common. E.g., every language has its sound system, its word system, its word organizational system. In the same way, every language has its grammatical categories like the parts of the speech. African languages share in this universal property of linguistic categories of parts of speech. I will take my example from the Igbo language. Igbo language belongs to the Niger-Congo family group of African languages. The Igbo African language has 8 parts of speech, as it is in most languages of the world. And these 8 parts of speech are aha or mbaha, which is the noun in English. Example, Emeka nkịta aba. There is nochiaha, the pronoun in English, and example, mo, anyị, unu, ha. We have the nkọwa in Igbo adjectives. In Igbo, we have nkọwa and in English adjectives. Words used in the description of nouns. Example, ọma, ọjọọ, ilu, and so on. Then there is the ngwa, which is the verb in English. That's action words like bịara, jere, na-eme. There is also the nkwuwa, which is the 5th. What is adverb in English? These are modifiers. Words are modified. Example in Igbo is ọsịsọ, nwayọ, ngwa ngwa, and so on. The 6th, we have the njikọ in English, which is the conjunction. Example of conjunctions in Igbo are na, ma, maọbụ. These are words that join phrases, words, and sentences. Then there is the mbuzo in Igbo, which in English is a preposition used in showing the relationship between 2 things. E.g., is the na. In English, we can have them as inside, like n'ime akpa, inside a bag, n'elu oche, on top of a chair, n'akụkụ oche, beside a chair. So this inside, on, and beside in Igbo are represented with just one lexical attempt, which is na. The last but not the least is the ntimpu, which is the 80th part of speech, which is the interjection in English. This is used to express sudden feelings. Example, ewo, ha, ewu, olo, ebeo, and so on. So with these few examples from the Igbo language, we can say that Igbo language or African languages are capable of challenging linguistic categories of parts of speech as it is in the languages of the world.
Yeah, the diversity of African languages would not allow me to make a general statement, but let me focus on Yoruba language and the different parts of speech. There are some of them that the students are not conversant with in English, like the gerunds, for instance. The gerunds, which in Yoruba we form from the verbs, and they can actually start a sentence. Usually verbs in Yoruba do not start sentences except they are commands. And we also have what we call the split verbs. And I'm sure in English too, they probably have the split verbs, but they're not very prominent. The nouns are prominent and we name them ororuko, that is the word for names. The verbs we name oroishe and oroadipo and all of that. There are Yoruba names for some of these things. As long as the students can cope with it, or if they're used to it in English, it will not be a problem to explain to them, what these different parts of speech mean. And we tend to use the parts of speech in a communicative way. We include it and embed it in what we're saying, and they figure it out. But sometimes we have to be very explicit to explain to them that the gerund for so in Yoruba is siso. And what you've noticed also is that these gerunds have mobility. They can move from either side of a noun. Onje sise, sise, onje, and it will still remain valid. So yeah, it could be a challenge at times. And the challenge in Yoruba is when the learners are not conversant with that part of speech in English or in their first language.
In what ways do I think African languages challenge the linguistic categories of parts of speech, such as nouns, verbs, etc.? In principle, in no way. For me, the linguistic analysis of an individual language is to find the meaning of a form that is the unit in the language. In order to find a unit in form, we often need to make systematic distinctions in the lexicon, such as what is a noun, what is a verb. Sometimes because nouns take different personal markers from verbs, or can be the subject in a sentence. The definition of what is a noun and what is a verb, or any other word category, depends on the language. And whether you need to define nouns, verbs, or adjectives also depends on the need for these concepts in your analysis of a language. Whether a concept like pregnant is expressed in an adjective, a verb, or a noun is different from language to language. The need for such word categories is not different in African languages. Of course, this exercise of determining word categories is not without its challenges. For example, in Serer of Senegal, it is possible and necessary to make use of the categories noun and verb. But for many Serer words, it's impossible and unhelpful to decide a priori whether a particular lexical unit is a verb or a noun. Another example. For some African languages, we find it necessary to introduce idiophone as a word category, while for many other African languages, these words can fall under interjections. But especially in the less central word categories, such as idiophones and interjections, language describers often depart from a strict form-to-function approach, and use these labels in a more functional and less structural way. And I found myself in that situation too. For example, one may claim that the category of preposition in Swahili is marginal at best. Still, I want to state that the locational noun paka, which means border, develops to a preposition, meaning to and until. And it is in this use only that the word is borrowed in the other languages of East Africa. So I have to talk about preposition, regardless of whether I really need a category of preposition in my analysis of the languages of East Africa. This is the more functional approach to parts of speech analysis, which only makes sense after the strict form-to-function analysis. And sorry for lecturing today.
For the purpose of time, let me examine noun, which is defined as the name of a person, place, or thing in English. But in some African languages, for example, in Esan language, a verb could be a noun, whereas it is an action word in English. For instance, mwene, meaning living, is a noun in Esan, but a verb by translation in English language. This is a major opposing linguistic contrast between English and Esan. In translation, it could also be translated as a verb into English. This implies that in Esan, a noun could just be the name of a person, place, or thing, and it could also include actions as verbs. This is bound to create problems. In translation, this contrast is also available in most other African languages. Therefore, skills and experience are required in the translation of such languages into English words.
Kwaziwai vateereri, kushanda kwandinoita nemutauro wechiShona kunoita kuti ndigare ndichifananidza mutauro uyu nemutauro wechirungu. Ndakaona iyi iri nzira yakareruka yekugadzira nayo zvidzidzo zvechiShona, nekuti kune magwaro mazhinji anowanika ekufunda mutauro wechirungu. Ndinofananidza ndichiona kuti ndingadzidzisewo sei mutauro wechishona. Zvakare, vadzidzi vangu vanotaura chirungu, saka zviri nyore kutsanangura zvinhu ndichishandisa mazwi echirungu pamwe nemifananidzo. Ndichataura pamusoro pezvinhu zvitatu zvandasangana nazvo mukugadzira zvidzidzo zvangu nemukuturikira nyaya dzevana vadiki, zvinoita kuti ndifunge kuti kuda hadzisi nguva dzese dzatinowana mutauro wechishona uchifambirana nemitemo yemuumbirwo wemutauro pamwe nemapato emarudzi emazwi ariko. Chekutanga, kumutauro wechishona kunoshandiswa nyaudzosingwi zvakanyanya. Panyaya dzevadiki dzandinoturikira dziri mulibrary yeZimbo Original, muzhinji dzacho ndinowedzera nyaudzosingwi kana ndoturikira kubva kumutauro wechirungu ndichiisa muchishona, nokuti ndinenge ndichida kunyatsoburitsa mutauriro wandingaite kana ndichitaura chishona. Semuenzaniso, ndinoona kuti pachinzvimbo cheverb neadverb, ini ndinogona kungoshandisa nyaudzosingwi chete kana ndoisa muchishona. Asi zvakare, imo muchirungu macho, unogona kuwanawo izwi rimwe rinogona kutsiva verb neadverb, kunyange zvazvo richinge risiri nyaudzosingwi. Chechipiri, mumutauro wechishona munoshanda tone zvakanyanya. Musi uno ndakapa mwana wangu bhuku randakaita kuti amboverenga. Ndaida kuti andibatsire kutsvaga kana pane panogona pakakanganisika. Akatanga kuverenga ndokuti musi, ini ndokumuti aiwa, zvinonzi musi. Akaseka zvikanzi, ko zvino ndinoziva sei kuti izwi racho rinotaurwa sei? Saka tinoona kuti mumutauro wechishona izwi rinogona kunge ritori chirevo chizere, zvichingoenderana nekuti waritaura netone yakaita sei. Asi kana ndichinyora, hapana nzira iripo yekuratidza kusiyana kwetone. Zvinenge zvotoda kuti muverengi atarise zvimwe zvakanyorwa zvakakomberedza izwi racho kuti azive kuti apa overenga seizwi here kana kuti sechirevo. Chibodzwa changu chekupedzesera, muenzaniso uri pamusoro pezvipauro. Mumutauro wechishona, zvipauro chaizvo zvaunosangana nazvo hazvina kumbowanda. Kazhinji tinoshandisa mamwewo mazwi sezvipauro. Pamamwe mazwi aya anogona kushanda sezvipauro, mazhinji acho anoumbwa kubva kuzviito. Mamwewo anobva kumazita chaiwo. Semuenzaniso, ndinogona kuti murume nyope, zvichireva lazy man. Muchishona, murume izita rinoreva man. Nyope izita zvakare rinoreva lazy person. Asi pandinozoti murume nyope, izwi rekuti nyope rinenge roshanda sechipauro. Kubva pazvinhu zvitatu zvandataura pamusoro pazvo, tinoona kuti hadzisi nguva dzese dzatinowana mutauro wechishona uchifambirana nemitemo yemuumbirwo wemutauro pamwe nemapato emarudzi emazwi ariko. Kusiri kuti chishona ndiwo mutauro wandakakura mauri, ndaigona kuzoona nhamo chaizvo pabasa rangu rekufundisa nekunyora, sezvo kusina magwaro nezvinyorwa zvakawanda zvinowanika zvingabatsire pakufundisa mutauro uyu.
African languages challenge the linguistic categories of parts of speech that have long been dominant in language research and teaching. Many African languages are tonal, meaning the pitch at which a word is spoken can change its meaning. This feature introduces a layer of complexity that is not present in many non-African languages. In languages like Yoruba and Akan, serial verb constructions allow multiple verbs to appear in a sentence without conjunctions. These constructions can express complex actions and sequences, challenging the traditional categorization of verbs and how they interact with each other and other parts of speech. Let's use Yoruba as an example. Yoruba is a tonal language, meaning the tone used when pronouncing a word can entirely change its meaning. For instance, owo, 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 and owo. This tonal complexity adds a layer that traditional linguistic categories, often based on non-tonal languages, do not account for. In Yoruba, certain words can serve multiple functions without changing their form. A single word might function as a noun, verb, or adjective, depending on its context. For example, dudu is an adjective in omedudu, a noun in duduyemi, and a verb in hodudu. This flexibility contrasts with the rigid categorization found in many non-African languages, where words typically belong to specific parts of speech. In Yoruba, the pronouns he, she, and it are not distinguished. The context provided by the preceding or following sentence clarifies whether the speaker is referring to he, she, or it. This fluidity challenges the rigid distinctions often made between parts of speech in traditional grammar. Yoruba often employs serial verb constructions, where multiple verbs are used together in a single clause to convey complex actions or sequences. For example, Ade ra ewúrẹ́ pata, Ade bought a goat, killed, sold it. This construction blurs the lines between individual verb usage and challenges the traditional categorization of verbs as distinct standalone units. In Yoruba, adjectives are often formed using verbs. For example, the adjectives dudu, kukuru, pupo are derived from du, kuru, and po. This means that adjectives in Yoruba are often contextually tied to verbs, which challenges the traditional separation of adjectives as a distinct category. By embracing these linguistic features, Yoruba challenges the traditional categories of parts of speech. Thank you.
Ụdịdị ọtụtụ asụsụ ndị Afrịka dị iche n'asụsụ mba ndị ofesi. Asụsụ Igbo, asụsụ ihe karịrị nde mmadụ 40 na-asụ n'ọwụwa anyanwụ Naịjirịa, adabachaghị n'ụdịdị asụsụ mba ndị ofesi. Igbo bụ asụsụ ụdaolu nke nhazi ahịrịokwu ya bụ n'ime isiokwu, ngwa, mmeju ngwa. Mgbe ụfọdụ, asụsụ Igbo na-ama aka nye nkewasị nkeji asụsụ site n'ọnọdụ ma ọ bụ ụdịdị nkeji asụsụ ahụ. Anyị ga-eji nkeji asụsụ atọ, nnọchiaha, mbuụzọ na nkọwa were nye ọmụmaatụ. Nnọchiaha. N'asụsụ Bekee, a na-eji nnọchiaha nwoke ma ọ bụ nwaanyị nke bụ he ma ọ bụ she n'otu n'otu egosi na onye a na-ekwu maka ya bụ nwoke ma ọ bụ nwaanyị. Ọ dịghị otu ahụ n'asụsụ Igbo, kama ọ bụ ọ ma ọ bụ o ka eji egosi ha. Nke a dabere n'ụdị ume nọ na mkpụrụ okwu na-esote nnọchiaha ahụ. Ndakọrịta ụdị ume. Ọmụmaatụ: Okeke male went to the market. He bought some items. Okeke gara ahịa, ọ zụtagasịrị ihe. Ada female went to the market. She bought some items. Ada gara ahịa, ọ zụtagasịrị ihe. N'ahịrịokwu ndị a, 1a na 2a, he na she ka eji gosipụta nwoke na nwaanyị n'otu n'otu n'asụsụ Bekee, ebe eji ọ nọchite anya ma nwoke ma nwaanyị na 1b na 2b n'asụsụ Igbo. Mbuụzọ. Mbuụzọ n'asụsụ Igbo na-egosi ebe ihe dị. Mkpụrụ okwu eji mara mbuụzọ n'Igbo bụ na. Mgbe mkpụrụ edemede na-esote na bụ ụdị ume, a na-enwe ndapụ ụdị ume. Ya bụ na a nọ na na-adapụ, ewere kọma elu dochie ya. Ọmụmaatụ: A book is up. Otu akwụkwọ dị n'elu. Mgbe mkpụrụ edemede na-esote na bụ mgbochi ume, a na-ede na n'uju. He lives in Kano. O bi na Kano. Ewepụ tupu, ya bụ before, ọ bụ na ka eji anọchite anya mbuụzọ ndị ọzọ niile nọ na Bekee. Nkọwa aha. Nkọwa aha bụ mkpụrụ okwu ndị na-akọwa mkpọ aha. Ọnọdụ nkọwa aha n'asụsụ Bekee na-abụkarị n'ihu mkpa aha ha na-akọwa. N'asụsụ Igbo, nkọwa aha bụkwa mkpụrụ okwu ndị na-akọwa mkpa aha, mana mkpa aha na-abịa tupu nkọwa aha ọ na-akọwa. Ọmụmaatụ, that big house is fine. Nnukwu ụlọ ahụ mara mma. N'asụsụ Igbo, mgbe ọbụla nkọwa aha gbanwere ọnọdụ ya n'ahịrịokwu, mata na ọ naghịzi arụ ọrụ dịka nkọwa aha. Ndewonu.
Parts of speech are labeled based on what they do or the function they perform in a language. And we know that each language has the way it orders its words. Because there is a deviation from that of English or any other European language, it does not translate into challenging it. So what constitutes a verb in English language, for instance, may not necessarily be so in Igbo language. African languages, when they behave in a different way from all of this, it does not necessarily constitute challenge. It just shows the distinctiveness. Or except we are saying there are other parts of speech beyond the existing 8. Now, here are some ways African languages differ from those categories that we've known. There are some African languages, such as Yoruba and Igbo, where nouns and verbs are not clearly distinguishable, because words can function as both nouns and verbs, depending on the context. So we find examples, particularly verbal nouns, where an example is the word jije in Yoruba language. Jije means to eat, and je is the verb. So it is drawn from that, je. And when we come to adjectives, sometimes we find that some African languages do not have separate class of words. Instead, they are expressed through verbs and nouns. Same with relative clauses, where they are used to express what could be considered adjectival meanings in European languages. And when we move on to adverbs, we see that some are not clearly separable when we look at class of words. Instead, they are also often expressed through verbs, nouns, or even phrases. When we look at word order and syntax, there are times that we have non-linear word order, and they can also show that distinctiveness and difference from what we know. And then polysynthesis is also another characteristic. The morphological complexity that we find in some African languages, particularly example is Bantu language, where meaning have complex morphological structures that can differ from the traditional notion of parts. And so by way of conclusion, I will say that recognizing and having an understanding of these differences, as well as respecting their distinctiveness, can provide valuable insights into the diversity of human language. And to this end, linguists can develop more nuanced and inclusive theories of language.
My reflection for this month's podcast is on how African languages reimagine linguistic structures. The traditional linguistic categories like nouns, verbs, and even adjectives have been shaped largely by the European language structures. And so when we look at African languages, and especially those from the Kalenjin community like Marakwet, which I will be using seeing as I come from that community, we find fascinating challenges to these established categories. In Marakwet, like many African languages, we don't always separate words neatly into nouns or verb categories. Our language shows that meaning often lives in how words connect and transform rather than in rigid categories. If we are to take our noun class system, for example, we don't simply have masculine and feminine like European languages. Instead, we group nouns by qualities like living things, extended objects, or even collective items. And this rich classification reveals how our ancestors, for example, viewed the relationships between things in their world. And our verb systems tell stories in ways that English cannot. And you can find that a single verb form in Marakwet can express an entire situation that might need several sentences in English. For example, through tone changes and affixes, we can show when something happened, how it happened, and even how we feel about it happening, all in one word. And what Europeans call adjectives often don't exist as separate words in our language because we might use verb-like words to describe qualities, and this is in respect to what we see, that is the properties of these objects, other than viewing them as static. These differences aren't just curiosities, they reveal deeper truths about how communities understand reality, so that when researchers force African languages into European grammatical boxes, they then miss the wisdom that is embedded in our linguistic structures. And by studying languages like Marakwet, which I have cited in this recording, we gain new perspectives on human communication. And perhaps there aren't universal parts of speech after all, but rather diverse ways that communities organize meaning to reflect their unique worldviews.
Would you believe that I had just woken from a dream where I was discussing the non-conformist nature of Yoruba grammatical classes with my professor when I opened my email and found this topic? Yes, that is exactly what happened. Now, you see, the Yoruba language challenges widely accepted linguistic classifications. Although we refer to them as isorioro, that is, categories of speech, they function as an interconnected system of grammatical classes, working together in a fluid manner that resists the rigid distinctions found in conventional linguistic models. For example, words categorized as pronouns and adjectives according to the Western definition may be grouped in the noun class, while some adverbs may in fact be verbs or adjectives. Now let's take pronouns for instance. The short form pronouns in Yoruba, mo, o, e, and so on clearly align with traditional pronoun structures. But you see the long form, or the ones we call the emphatic pronouns, such as emi, iwo, awa, ohun, those ones behave like nouns. What do I mean? They share structural similarities with Yoruba nouns, such as occurring in the same syntactic environment, both in subject and object positions, just like nouns, and they can co-occur with short form pronouns, and that's something short form pronouns cannot do among themselves. So we can't have orio. You have to say but you can say iwori, but you cannot say orio. I hope you get that. Now, for adverbs, those ones even present a greater challenge. What do I mean? Many words traditionally classified as adverbs, in Yoruba, can be traced back to other speech categories when we break them down to their base morpheme. And when you look at the definition of adverbs, which is their function is to modify verbs, they provide information on how, when, or even where an action takes place. Now let's take dear in Yoruba as an example. In the sentence, O John, dear, which is he, she, it, ate slowly. Now you see the word dear is a duplicated form of dear, which means little or small. And by definition of what an adjective is, dear is actually an adjective. Yet, in the sentence initial position where we can say something like, dear, lo you see me, that is little bit of open bracket of something close bracket appeared to me, dear in that sentence will function as a noun. And let's go further and look at Lano yesterday. In Ariomo, Lano, we saw a child yesterday. Lano is actually formed with preposition ni, which means in, and the noun ano, which means yesterday. So if we were to break that down, we would most likely put it under the class PP in a syntactic structure. So you see, these complexities raise a fundamental question. That was what came to my mind when I saw the email for this topic. And I just really would like to ask, should we continue classifying words based on generic Western linguistic definitions, or should African languages redefine their grammatical categories according to their inherent structural and functional dynamics? I think that's what we've begun to do with the Yoruba language, and I just believe it's time to embrace a more fluid, context-driven approach that reflects the linguistic reality of our African languages.
African languages are unique in various ways as it differs from the traditional linguistic categories, in the sense that it does not have a clear-cut distinction between parts of speech, as the same word can perform the role of a noun and also a verb, depending on the tone of the speaker. Most times, the emotional disposition of an African language speaker can determine the meaning of the word. This is completely different from the Western linguistic categories, where words can clearly be separated from the speaker's emotion. There is also the lack of subject and object distinction due to the communal lifestyle of the African people. Some African languages speak in the opposite way to mean the real state of affairs. In Yoruba language, for instance, when someone says Mumbo, it can mean that he is going, and it also means that he is coming, depending on where the speaker is located at the time of communication. If he is standing with you, it means that he is going, but you will see him at other times. But if he is far away from you, it means that he is on his way to your location. This linguistic uniqueness is not found in the traditional linguistic categories. Furthermore, African languages often have complex system of morphology, and this challenges the traditional notion of what constitutes a word. Also, the multilingual context of African languages makes it difficult to have a clear-cut distinction between language and dialect, as they are completely interwoven. Hence, the challenges of ambiguity of the African language system makes it difficult to fit into the traditional linguistic categories of parts of speech.
Those are all the contributions we received for this episode. What did you think of their analyses? Do you agree that their examples challenge the linguistic categories of parts of speech, or do you think African languages get along fine with them? Tell us in the comments below. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 41 of Afrikanists Assemble. If you haven't heard our other 40 episodes, feel free to go to our channel and look through our videos for any topics you might be interested in. And while you're there, click on the subscribe button so you see our upcoming episodes when we publish them. See you around. Panodo bodo no mi wa bonodo so